3 minutes ago, the political world shook to its core. Donald Trump, never one to hold back, turned his fire on Labour leader Keir Starmer in a live televised moment that stunned both America and Britain. It wasn't a slip of the tongue. It wasn't a passing insult. It was a ferocious takedown, delivered with the kind of force only Trump can unleash, and it left Britain gasping in disbelief. Social media ignited like wildfire, headlines flashed across every screen, and within seconds, Starmer's carefully built image was ripped apart before the eyes of millions. This wasn't politics as usual. This was humiliation on the world stage, and it's already being called one of the most brutal clashes in modern political history. With deliberate precision, Trump let the name hang in the air. Starmer, he said slowly, almost mocking the syllables. Then came the hammer blow. Weakest leader I've ever seen. The words landed like a thunderclap, silencing the room. Shocking reporters who scrambled to catch every detail. Gasps rippled through the press corps. The cameras zoomed in. Millions watching at home felt the weight of the insult crash down. But Trump wasn't finished. He went further, much further. He accused Starmer of being a puppet for Brussels, of secretly planning to drag Britain back into the European Union through backroom deals and hidden promises. He slammed his record on borders, immigration and crime, painting a picture of a man unfit to defend Britain's future. His voice rose, his gestures grew sharper, and every line struck with devastating precision. He's weak on crime, weak on borders, weak on Britain, Trump declared, his tone dripping with disdain. It was raw, unscripted, and impossible to ignore. Within seconds, the moment detonated across the world. Social media platforms lit up with clips of Trump's scathing attack. Hashtags trended instantly. Weakest leader, puppet for Brussels, a Trump by Starmer. Memes, videos, and furious debates consumed timelines. In London, Labour officials went into emergency meetings, scrambling to decide how to respond, while inside Starmer's headquarters, silence reigned. No statement came, no rebuttal was offered. The longer the silence stretched, the louder the humiliation seemed to grow. Across the Atlantic, British media outlets plastered Trump's tirade across their front pages. Tabloids branded it the most savage takedown of a UK politician by an American leader in decades. Talk radio shows lit up as callers vented outrage, not just at Trump, but at Starmer himself. Some accused him of betrayal, others of cowardice, but nearly all agreed. The optics were disastrous. Even Labour MPs whispered privately that the damage was severe. One senior figure admitted bluntly that people don't forget moments like this. It's going to haunt us. And that is the true danger, because this wasn't just about Trump's words. It was about how those words cut into the very heart of Britain's political debate. By branding Starmer a puppet of Brussels, Trump didn't just attack a man, he reignited the deepest wound in British politics, Brexit. In working-class towns, in former Labour strongholds that voted to leave, Trump's words resonated with unnerving clarity. For those voters, suspicion of Starmer was already simmering. Now it had been crystallised into a single phrase that spread like wildfire: puppet for Brussels. As the dust settled from the press conference, one thing was undeniable. Starmer had been dragged into a fight he didn't choose against a man who knows how to dominate a stage. And in those critical first moments, as the cameras rolled and the headlines raced ahead, Starmer's silence looked less like strategy and more like surrender. For Labour, this was no ordinary setback. It was the spark of a crisis that could define an election, shift public opinion, and leave a permanent scar on Britain's political landscape. The fallout from Trump's attack did not take hours or days to unfold. It detonated instantly, spreading like a political wildfire across Britain. Within minutes of the broadcast, television networks were replaying the clip on loop. Anchors framed it as a turning point. Panellists dissected every word, and headlines screamed across the bottom of screens: Trump destroys Starmer. This wasn't just commentary, it was a narrative being carved into the public mind in real time. Starmer's silence became its own story. The cameras may have been on Trump, but the nation's gaze turned quickly to the Labour leader's lack of response. Where was he? Why hadn't he fired back? Was he too afraid, too cautious, too unsure? For a man who had built his image on calm professionalism, that very calm now looked like fragility. To his critics, it looked like surrender. And in the brutal world of politics, perception can destroy faster than any policy failure. Across Britain, the reactions divided sharply, but the damage cut across every faction. Right-leaning tabloids seized the moment, presenting Trump's outburst as proof that Britain's allies could see Starmer's weakness more clearly than his own party did. Even centrist outlets, which often avoided the hyperbole of partisan media, could not ignore the scale of the moment. Their headlines were cautious, but the footage spoke louder than words. Trump fiery, Starmer silent, the imbalance undeniable. In working-class towns across the north of England, the attack hit with particular force. These were communities still defined by the scars of Brexit, places where suspicion of Brussels remained high and where Labour had already struggled to rebuild trust. Callers on local radio stations vented anger, demanding answers from a leader who had promised clarity but now offered only silence. One caller in Stoke put it bluntly, "If Trump can see Starmer's weakness, why can't Labour?" The sentiment resonated, echoing across pubs, workplaces and online forums where politics was being argued with newfound urgency. Inside Labour headquarters, panic began to set in. Advisers huddled in emergency meetings, torn between two disastrous choices: hit back hard against Trump and risk escalating the feud, or downplay his remarks and risk looking even weaker. Both paths carried danger. Striking back could draw Britain into a war of words with an American political giant who thrived on conflict. But ignoring him made Starmer look diminished, a man unwilling or unable to defend himself and his party on the global stage. For hours, no statement came. That silence, stretched across the airwaves, did more damage than any words ever could. The Conservatives, meanwhile, knew an opportunity when they saw one. Senior figures avoided repeating Trump's more incendiary remarks, but their press briefings leaned into the narrative. They reminded voters of the need for strong leadership in uncertain times, hinting that Starmer had failed the very first test of global scrutiny. Without saying much at all, they managed to tie Trump's words to their own message. Labour cannot be trusted with Britain's future. It was a subtle yet devastating move, allowing Trump to do the dirty work while they reap the benefits. Nigel Farage, however, wasted no time. For him, Trump's attack was a gift from the heavens. He praised Trump's honesty, declaring that the former president had said what millions of Britons were already thinking. On television and in interviews, Farage painted Starmer as a man exposed before the world, too soft to lead and too weak to defend Britain's sovereignty. He framed himself once again as the populist truth-teller, the man unafraid to speak the words others dared not. For disillusioned voters angry at both Labour and the Conservatives, that message hit home. As the storm intensified, social media became a battlefield of ridicule and rage. Memes of Starmer's silence flooded Twitter and Facebook. Clips of Trump's fiery delivery were edited into viral videos, and hashtags trended for days. It wasn't just political junkies paying attention. Ordinary voters scrolling through their phones were confronted again and again with the image of a Labour leader humiliated on the global stage. In the digital age, repetition is power, and this repetition was merciless. What made the situation even more dangerous for Starmer was that Trump's attack didn't just insult him personally. It tapped directly into Britain's deepest political wounds. By branding him a puppet of Brussels, Trump had revived the lingering bitterness of Brexit, a subject that still divides the nation. For millions who had voted to leave, the accusation resonated like a warning that Labour under Starmer would betray their vote, drag Britain back under European control and erase the hard-won independence they believed they had secured. In this sense, Trump's words were more than insults. They were weapons, sharp, direct and perfectly aimed at Britain's most sensitive fault lines. And as the dust settled, it became clear that this wasn't just a bad day for Keir Starmer. It was the opening act of a crisis that would ripple across every corner of British politics, shaking the foundations of his leadership and perhaps even reshaping the outcome of the next election. By the next morning, the confrontation had already morphed from a viral clip into a full-blown political saga. Britain woke up to front pages plastered with Trump's words, bold headlines screaming "weakest leader ever" and "puppet for Brussels." For Starmer, it was a nightmare unfolding in slow motion. Every paper, every broadcaster, every commentator had seized on the attack, dissecting it, amplifying it, and embedding it into the national conversation. In the age of 24-hour news, this wasn't just a moment, it was a cycle. Relentless and unforgiving. On television, panel discussions grew heated. Analysts debated whether Trump's remarks carried real weight or were simply the rantings of a former US president desperate for attention. But no matter the verdict, the clip itself was replayed over and over. Viewers didn't need the analysis. They saw it with their own eyes. Trump furious, defiant, dominant. Starmer absent, silent, diminished. It was an image that no amount of spin could undo. And in politics, perception often matters far more than facts. Inside Labour, cracks began to widen. Senior MPs whispered their frustration, some openly questioning why their leader had failed to strike back. A few called for an immediate, hard-hitting response, something fiery enough to reassure voters that Starmer was no pushover. Others urged restraint, warning that taking on Trump would only deepen the feud and hand him more publicity. The indecision was crippling. Every hour without a clear response reinforced the perception of weakness. One insider was overheard saying bitterly, "We needed strength. Instead, we got silence." Meanwhile, across Britain's working class heartlands, where Brexit had redrawn the political map, Trump's words echoed with unnerving force. In towns that had voted overwhelmingly to leave, the accusation of being a puppet for Brussels struck a nerve. Local radio shows were flooded with callers venting their anger. On community forums and social media groups, suspicion hardened into resentment. Some who had been on the fence about Labour now declared they would never trust Starmer to defend Britain's sovereignty. For them, Trump's blunt language crystallised long-held doubts. The Conservatives, though careful in their public tone, recognised the goldmine before them. They didn't need to shout. Subtle nods, quiet reminders of the need for firm leadership, and well-placed briefings to the press were enough to amplify the damage. Ministers spoke vaguely about Britain's strength, sovereignty and global standing, but everyone knew the subtext: Labour was too weak, Starmer too hesitant, and the risk of trusting him too great. The genius of their strategy was that they never had to repeat Trump's insults directly. The images and headlines were doing the job for them. Nigel Farage, on the other hand, went all in. He seized every microphone, every camera, every chance to repeat Trump's words with relish. To Farage, this was vindication, proof that his long-standing warnings about Labour's ties to Brussels were not just political spin, but truths now spoken by one of the world's most notorious political heavyweights. Trump said what millions are already thinking, Farage boomed on talk radio, his words echoing across Britain's airwaves. And the more he said it, the more ordinary voters nodded in agreement. As the storm escalated, the pressure on Starmer mounted. When he finally appeared before reporters, his response was cautious, measured and restrained. He spoke of the importance of maintaining strong relations with America, of looking forward rather than backward, of constructive politics over personal attacks. The words were polished, the delivery calm, but in the eyes of many, it was too little, too late. The clip of Trump's fiery denunciation had already burned itself into the public imagination. Against that raw, unfiltered power, Starmer's careful statements felt hollow, almost timid. The reaction was swift and merciless. Commentators declared that Starmer had failed the first real test of his resilience. Pollsters recorded early shifts in opinion, with Starmer's personal approval ratings dipping noticeably in key swing constituencies. Focus groups described him as hesitant, uncertain, and unprepared. Even among Labour loyalists, unease was growing. If Starmer couldn't stand up to Trump, they wondered, how could he stand up to world leaders in future negotiations? And then came the repetition, the most dangerous weapon in modern politics. Every news cycle, every talk show, every viral post dragged the story back into the spotlight. Trump's words weren't just remembered. They were etched, replayed, memified and recycled endlessly. the label's weakest leader and puppet for Brussels, became shorthand for Starmer's entire image. Once those phrases stuck, they became almost impossible to shake. For Starmer, this was more than a political attack, it was a branding. In a single moment, Donald Trump had stamped him with an image of weakness that threatened to define him in the eyes of millions. And as the days passed, the sense grew stronger. Not that this was just a bad week, but that this was the beginning of a crisis capable of reshaping Britain's political future. The fallout didn't just stay in Britain, it went global. International outlets picked up the clash, turning it into a spectacle watched from Washington to Brussels, from Berlin to Beijing. CNN ran the headline, "Trump versus Starmer, a transatlantic war of words." European networks dissected the exchange with unease, hinting that if Britain's own Prime Minister was being humiliated so openly by Trump, then perhaps London's standing in the world was more fragile than anyone had dared admit. Across the Atlantic, Fox News amplified Trump's outburst with relentless coverage, hailing it as proof of his unmatched influence in global politics. For Starmer, the humiliation was now international. In Britain, the mood darkened further. The opposition leader had been exposed, and voters could feel it. Opinion polls trickled in, and they told a grim story. Labour's lead, once considered unshakable, was shrinking. Focus groups spoke of trust, strength and leadership, qualities they suddenly doubted Starmer possessed. The narrative of weakness was becoming cemented, not just in Westminster corridors, but in the minds of ordinary citizens. And once the public begins to doubt, history shows it is almost impossible to restore their faith. Inside number 10, whispers turned into open panic. Senior Labour strategists convened late-night meetings, frantically debating how to reclaim control of the narrative. Some urged a bold counterattack, take Trump head-on, prove to voters that Starmer could fight fire with fire. Others warned that engaging Trump directly would be political suicide, that his attacks thrived on attention and confrontation. The indecision was fatal. Each day that passed without a decisive response made Starmer look weaker, his leadership less certain, and his future more precarious. Meanwhile, Trump continued his barrage. He gave interviews, repeated his insults, and doubled down on his claim that Britain was being dragged back under Brussels' thumb because of Starmer's leadership. Every word was picked up by the tabloids, every soundbite replayed on social media. The story refused to die. Instead, it evolved, gaining momentum with each passing hour. The image of Trump dominating the conversation while Starmer stumbled in silence became the defining picture of the moment. Nigel Farage capitalised further. With his signature grin, he framed Trump's words as the voice of the people, raw, unpolished, but true. He claimed that what Trump said openly was what millions of ordinary Britons whispered privately, that Starmer was not strong enough, not independent enough, not British enough in his instincts to truly lead. Farage turned Trump's attack into a rallying cry for his own movement, and in doing so, he tapped into a deep reservoir of frustration simmering across the nation. Then came the unexpected twist. Reports emerged that senior European officials were quietly alarmed by Trump's remarks. In Brussels, the concern was that Starmer's perceived weakness might embolden Eurosceptic voices in Britain, undermining cooperation before it could begin. Behind closed doors, whispers circulated that if Labour faltered, Britain's role in Europe could collapse altogether. Ironically, Trump's attack, meant to damage Starmer personally, was now shaking the foundations of Britain's relationship with its closest neighbours. The Conservatives, sensing opportunity, sharpened their knives. Cabinet ministers spoke cryptically of the need for resilient leadership in uncertain times. The phrase was repeated like a mantra, an indirect but devastating contrast to the image of a prime minister humiliated on the world stage. For voters already uneasy, it was a subtle reminder that perhaps Labour's promises of stability were nothing more than fragile illusions. The cumulative effect was undeniable. Starmer was losing control of the story, losing control of the narrative, and most dangerously of all, losing control of his image. In politics, once an image hardens in the public's mind, it becomes a prison from which escape is almost impossible. Trump had branded him as weak, and every hesitation, every delay, every cautious word from Starmer only reinforced that perception.